Good afternoon. We are happy to bring you today a visual retrospective on the art of Conrado Massaguer, a dominant force in graphic arts and periodicals in Cuba and abroad from the 1910s to the early 1960s. And we are honored to have with us Vicki Gold Levi, foremost collector of Massaguer's art and an author and collector of Cuban memorabilia. Vicki is an advisory board member of the Wilsonian Museum at Florida International University and has donated over 2,000 Cuban items to the museum. She is the co-author of Cuba's Style, Graphics from the Golden Age of Design, and the author of Promising Paradise. She has lectured on Cuba and Conrado Massaguer at numerous prestigious venues, including the Art Deco Society in New York City. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Vicki Gold Levi.
My thanks to the Cuban Cultural Center of New York for inviting me to present to the viewers the life and times of Conrado Massaguer. While I was researching my book, Cuba Style, The Golden Age of Graphics with Steve Heller, I came across a Social magazine on the desk of someone I was visiting who used to live in Cuba. I was mesmerized with the stunning graphics on the cover, and through Social became my obsession with Massaguer. And I became an avid fan of Massaguer, and I had an obsession to collect anything I could on him. My collection culminated in a show at the Wilsonian Museum in Miami Beach on Massaguer, and I donated my entire collection to the Wilsonian Museum, which is part of Florida International University. The graphic artist Conrado Walter Massaguer was born in 1889 and died in 1965. He helped shape the visual culture of his native Cuba between the 1920s and the 1960s. As founder and art director of two of Cuba's most important magazines, Massaguer mingled with dignitaries and celebrities, both local and foreign, many of whom he parodied in his syndicated caricatures. Through his magazines and his work for Cuba's Tourist Commission, he advanced modernist aesthetics, disseminated images of the new women, and promoted Cuba as a tourist destination. Massaguer also made an impact in the United States through illustrations he made for publications during several stretches that he spent in New York. Well-traveled and cosmopolitan, Massaguer synthesized the social and artistic trends of North America, Europe, and Latin America, and he became a tastemaker in Cuba. Born in Cardenas, Cuba, Massaguer spent much of his youth in Mexico and the United States. Returning to Havana in 1908, he formed an advertising agency and eventually moved into magazine publishing. He and his brother Oscar founded two of Cuba's most influential magazines, Social and Carteles. Carteles in 1919 aimed at more of the popular audience. In the late 1920s, Massaguer exhibited his caricatures in Paris and toured Europe. He spent most of the 1930s as a political exile in New York, where he contributed artwork to American magazines, and he returned to his homeland later that decade and solidified his reputation as a celebrated caricaturist of world leaders and other public figures. Carteles, published in 1919 and till 1960, was aimed at a more popular audience. The magazine offered news, cinema, theater reviews, and sports. Carteles highlighted artwork of some of Cuba's best illustrators on its covers and had more humor than chic. It reached the largest circulation of any daily or weekly in Latin America. Social best represents Massaguer's artistic and cultural influences in Cuba. Social and Carteles possesses the true sense of Cubanness. and strove to deliver an avant-garde sophistication to its readers. Social best represents Massaguer's artistic and cultural influences. It was founded in 1916 by Massaguer, and he art directed both Social and carteles with a style affectionately coined by a reporter as tropical chic. This 1926 cover is an example of Massaguer's wit, a classical theme with a man's tie discreetly decorating a body part. And this 1930s cover with a similar graphic aesthetic in a tennis motif. Massaguer's covers, such as this 1926 sensual exotic woman, set the tone for most of the graphic arts in the first half of the 20th century. The late Luz Marino, the revered professor of art history at University of Havana, said in her brilliant essay analysis of Social, "The most important thing about Social is the cover, because it is the combination between image and typography that makes Social stand out from the rest. The Art Deco designs in Social opened a path for contemporary graphic arts in Cuba." Massaguer created wonderful stylized graphic and fonts for Social, and he used very early revolutionary offset printing techniques, one of the first in this hemisphere. As an art director and publisher, Massaguer made Social a vehicle for shaking up conservative Cuban society. On its covers and within its pages, he promoted the new woman ideal, known as Massa girls. They were celebrated for wearing their hair in a short bob and disregarding constraining corsets and traditional values. Massaguer was quoted as saying, "Every time I return to the States, the girls' hair is shorter and the cigarette holders are longer." Massaguer Girls is a play on both the sound of Massaguer's surname and on massa, a kind of crude slang word referring to women's bodies, but that was his sense of humor. This woman is an original gouache in pencil on a board drawn in 1930 in New York City. Another pastel gouache, watercolor and pencil on board of a sensual dancer, emphasizing the Afro-Cuban origins of the rumba, was exhibited at New York's Delphic Studios in 1931. A very famous gouache of Massaguer's depicted his countrymen engaged in the national pastime of dominoes. This drawing was also exhibited at the Delphic Studios in Manhattan. While living in New York City in the 30s, Massaguer also worked as a commercial artist, and in 1935, after Prohibition, he produced the distillery ad for Carstairs Brothers. Designed in 1939 for the Cuban National Tourist Commission, this was one of his many ads promoting tourism in Cuba. Massaguer was devoted to promoting tourism in the most dignified and visiting presentation that he could do. As a youth in 1903, Massaguer attended a military school in upstate New York, and these are some of his rare doodles from his school days. Note his depiction of the Triangle building in Manhattan and the subway in New York City. Here is another doodle showing his early talents. He would send these to his father from military school. Back in 1923, Massaguer created a calling card introducing him to New York society. Quote, I'm young, single, and easy to look at, end of quote. However, when he did arrive in New York in 1924, he was no longer single, and his bride and niece of the former Cuban president, Garcia Manacol, spent their honeymoon at the Waldorf Astoria. He then opened up a studio for a short time and collaborated with early Life magazine, Vanity Fair, Red Book, Town and Country, Cosmopolitan, and others. When the couple went back to Havana, Social was thriving, and Massaguer also created advertisements for the magazine of both Cuba and the States. And here are a few advertisements that appeared in Nacional that Massaguer designed. The Tinajon jar is the symbol of Camagüey, Cuba, known as the City of Jars. A Coca-Cola ad. Coca-Cola was beloved in Cuba at the time, and Coca-Cola had its own bottling plant. And the New York store, B. Altman, exported clothes from its store to Havana. Massaguer had earlier created two advertising agencies, the graphic, and also he created the Graphic Arts Union and the First Hall of Humorists, along with other noted artists. Massaguer became more political, especially of President Machado, who reneged on his promise to serve a single term. Massaguer penned satirical attacks on him, and because of this, he joined a growing camp of political exiles, and he left to exhibit in Paris very successfully and back to New York City. When back in New York City, he collaborated with the Early Life magazine and other American periodicals. Massaguer went back and forth to New York City many times throughout his life. He spent much of the 1930s in New York City as a political exile. His caricatures from this time expressed enthusiasm for Franklin Delano Roosevelt and for much of the New Deal proposals. During this time, he directed both Carteles and Social from New York City. Massaguer was back in Cuba during the Second World War, where he put his caricatures to use in the service of the Allies, as seen here. Massaguer created this pamphlet for the 1939 World's Fair in New York City. And an interesting thing happened. Massaguer did this giant mural at the Cuba World's Fair exhibition, and it showed Roosevelt and many other dignitaries, and they were sitting at a table, and on the table was a rumba dancer dancing. Well, the president of Cuba at the time thought this was offensive, and when Massaguer came to the exhibition hall the next day, it was totally wiped out. But the Americans loved it, and the New York Times gave it a big story. Massaguer produced the center page spread depicting Roosevelt and other world leaders and celebrities ushering in the new year with a parade. This was in Cosmopolitan magazine. And this is the second page of this big spread. Once Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to office, Massaguer began supplying witty caricatures of his controversial National Recovery Administration aimed at reviving the economy. He continued to provide American magazines and publications with colorful art and illustrations. A favorite subject of Massaguer was King Alfonso XIII of Spain, shown here in Vanity Fair in 1930. He often worked for Vanity Fair. While living in New York City in the 30s, Massaguer joined the Coffee House Club and the Dutch Treat Club. Both clubs played host to New York illustrated writers and humorous writers as well, and both clubs are still active today. Massaguer contributed satirical illustrations to the Dutch Treat's annual book, as seen here. He contributed illustrations to many books here and in Cuba. This is the cover of one of the books called People Worth Talking About. He provided humorous portraits like this one of George Bernard Shaw in Cosmo Hamilton's book. He illustrated the 1941 cookery book for the British Ladies Committee in Aid of War Relief. And my own personal favorite is his witty illustration of the chef Winston Churchill cooking Hitler's goose for the war effort. I thought this showed his great wit. Massaguer was so versatile. Here are some of his witty postcards. I'm going to show you 3 postcards. Massaguer created a series of illustrated postcards, including caricaturing noted Cuban figures that he admired. This is Dr. Enrique J. Verona, the poet and founder of the magazine Revista Cubana. This is Eugenio Aspiazo, a contender for the 1916 election for the mayor of Havana, but he happened to have lost that election. Some of the favorite items I collected were Massaguer's spontaneous caricatures, sometimes drawing on napkins, programs, or menus. This is the piano concerto master, Mr. Joseph Hoffman, and a Cuban doctor, Perez Diaz. And I love this one. It's just a quick etching of a massa girl. And another on a yacht club menu. And a sketch on a menu of the National Hotel. Massaguer's early covers, before he started his own magazines, he worked for El Figaro magazine, and it reflected his concern as an illustrator. And here are 3 covers that he did for El Figaro. In 1922, the Institute of Arts and Graphics printed Guignol, which is the puppet show in French. It's a collection of Massaguer's caricatures. His books included such marvelous caricatures as Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, John D. Rockefeller, the philanthropist and business magnate, Raul Capablanca, the Cuban world chess champion from 1921 to 1927. Please note Massaguer has him riding on a knight chess piece for his own humorous interpretation. Towards the end of Massaguer's long career, he self-published an illustrated autobiography reproducing some of his popular characters. The book, Massaguer, His Life and Work. In this later book, he reproduced in color Sarah Bernhardt, the famous French actress in the early 19th and 20th century. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England from 1940 to 1945 during World War II. Diego Rivera, the world-renowned Mexican painter and muralist. And one of my favorite, a very amusing image of Charlie Chaplin, the man, holding up the character he invented, the little tramp. This was for a Cuban film magazine, Cinelandia. And a 1944 photo of Massaguer himself at the Club Casablanca in Havana. In the background is his oft-created World War II allies depicted on the back wall. Back in 1916, in New York City, in one of his trips, Massaguer drew Enrico Caruso on the top of this image, and on the bottom, Caruso drew Massaguer. A great caricature Massaguer drew also in New York is that of the artist Miguel Covarrubias. Massaguer greeted American movie stars Joan Blondell and Dick Powell as they arrived in Havana for their honeymoon in 1936. And in 1939 in Havana, the actor Errol Flynn, who is seated on the left, and his wife Lily Damita, also seated, with Massaguer standing on the right, was an example of how Massaguer mingled with celebrities. In Hollywood in 1951, Massaguer sketches actress Jeannie Foster. Another one of my favorites, a wonderful 1951 drawing he did of Walt Disney surrounded by his many animals. And in the same year, Massaguer actually met Walt Disney in 1951 when he visited him at the Disney Studios in Burbank, California. Massaguer enjoyed creating wooden caricatures, as seen here in 1940. This is a 1945 photo of Massaguer preparing his wooden caricatures. He worked in so many different mediums. I even had it at my exhibition in Miami Beach, a chair that he carved for someone who had a child. He was so versatile. This is celebrating his 50th birthday in 1957 with his friends and his beloved cutouts. And this is a song sheet he illustrated as a young man in 1910. And an early Art Deco style hotel directory from 1919. These are some of the pamphlets I'm showing you that he designed for the Cuba Tourist Commission. A 1925 brochure for the Hotel Plaza in Camagüey, Cuba. A 1940 Cuba tourist pamphlet. And a 1925 brochure for the Hotel Lincoln in Havana. A very amusing photo mailer he designed in 1940 for the famous Sloppy Joes in Havana, and it's still there today. They redesigned it, they refurbished it, and they opened it. A 1955 Welcome to Cuba brochure. At this time, Massaguer was the director of the Cuban Tourist Commission. Another favorite of mine, a very beautiful 1930 Massaguer pamphlet for the Tourist Commission that showed the positive qualities of Cuba. Following the overthrow of President Batista in 1959 by Fidel Castro, Massaguer published this book, providing the first caricatures of the revolutionaries. Many of the advertising within the book depicted the Castro followers enjoying American brands like Coca-Cola, Buick, and Jell-O, which would soon be off limits with Cuba after Castro cut ties with the United States. Social had long ceased publication, and Carteles ceased distribution in 1960. Massaguer would finish out his days quietly, working at the Cuba's National Archives. This is a self-portrait that he did in 1945. Thank you so much for joining me in my presentation of the life and work of Conrado Walter Massaguer, the greatest illustrator, publisher, and influencer of artistic life in Cuba. There'll never be another like Massaguer.